right, well, it's 11:03, so welcome everybody to our webinar about ending child marriage in DC. I will pass the mic to our dear colleague, Indira Hennard, who is the Executive Director of the DC Rape Crisis Center, to get us started this morning.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Casey. I'm so excited to be with you all, and the DC Rape Crisis Center is so excited to partner with the Tahirih Justice Center and End Child Marriage. As Casey mentioned, my name is Indira Hennard, and I'm the Executive Director of the DC Rape Crisis Center. This issue is near and dear to our heart because what we know to be true is that sexual violence is not a single issue because we don't live single issue lives. And so we always want to be intentional by doing our work from the intersections. What we also know is that ending child marriage is an issue that really has not gotten the level of attention that it needs to, particularly in the district. And so we're so excited to raise more awareness regarding this. I'm joined today by two wonderful advocates for ending child marriage. Sara Tasneem, who is a leading advocate for ending child marriage in the US. After surviving child marriage herself, Sara has worked for years to end child marriage and ensure no other child faces the same harms. Additionally, I'm joined by Alex Goyette, who is the Senior Public Policy Associate at the Tahirih Justice Center's Forced Marriage Initiative. Tahirih is a national organization with a greater DC office that serves immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. The Forced Marriage Initiative serves people facing forced marriage and providing training and technical assistance to other service providers who see forced marriages in their cases or their communities. Since 2017, Alex has worked with survivors and advocates across the US to pass laws ending child marriage. We will have time for question and answers at the end of this webinar, but in the meantime, please feel free to use the Q&A feature throughout the presentation. We have our colleague Rimple, who will be there to monitor questions as they come in. And with that said, I'm going to pass it off to Alex to get us started.
Thanks so much, Indira, for that great introduction. And thanks everyone for joining us today, spending part of your Friday with us. So as Indira mentioned, I'm Alex Goyette, Senior Public Policy Associate with the Tahirih Justice Center. Tahirih is a legal services organization that provides legal and social services to immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. And through our Forced Marriage Initiative, we also provide direct services to anyone in the US, immigrant or not, who's facing forced marriage in this country. And through our Forced Marriage Initiative, we also provide training and technical assistance to other service providers, as well as doing public policy advocacy on the issue. So to start us off, I just want to make sure that we're all working from the same sorts of definitions here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is forced marriage. And it really comes down to consent. Forced marriage is a marriage where one or both parties do not or cannot consent to that marriage. They typically involve elements of force, fraud, or coercion. And when we talk about consenting to the marriage, we're talking about consenting not only to the fact of the marriage, but also to its timing and to who the partner is. So we like to say when, whether, and whom that person is going to marry. I also want to be very clear that a forced marriage is not the same thing as an arranged marriage. In an arranged marriage, the families might take the lead on selecting a partner, but the ultimate decision about when, whether, and whom to marry still lies with the individuals involved in that marriage. Question we often get when we start talking about this issue is, does forced marriage really happen in the United States? Of course, unfortunately, the answer is yes, or we wouldn't be here having this webinar with you all today. In 2011, Tahirih published a national survey in which we asked service providers across the country whether they thought they had seen cases of forced marriage in their existing caseloads. We got over 500 responses to that survey from service providers in 47 states. And those respondents identified as many as 3,000 cases of forced marriage in their existing caseloads over a period of about 2 years. And close to half of all those respondents said that they had encountered at least one case. And so what that shows us is forced marriage, A, is happening, and B, it's showing up in places where it might not be as expected. It's showing up as sort of underlying other forms of violence or intersecting with other forms of violence. as far as who's impacted by forced marriage, the answer is unfortunately everyone in all communities in the United States. Our survey found that victims' families came from at least 56 different countries of origin. People were from all major religious backgrounds, as well as families without any practicing religion. The majority of victims are female, but some are male. And so this is very much a gendered issue. And you'll hear me using female pronouns for the majority of this presentation, but I don't want to lose the fact that this does impact boys and men as well. And victims were of all ages, adult and children, but many of the victims are under age 18, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So moving on more specifically to child marriage, and again, I'm just going to start with a definition. When you say child, a lot of different images can pop into someone's mind, but I want to be clear that when I say child marriage, I'm talking about the legal definition of a child, which is a person under the age of majority, and that's age 18 in most states and in DC. So studies have found that between 2000 and 2018, over 300 children married across the United States. And that's a result of, essentially the fact that laws across the United States allow this to happen. There's been a recent movement nationwide to limit and end child marriage across all of the states. But prior to that getting started, so in about 2015, every single state in the US, and of course, including DC, allowed child marriage in some form or another. At that time, 28 states had absolutely no minimum marriage age written in statute, and 41 states allowed parents to consent on behalf of a child to that marriage. And we find that to be particularly dangerous because what we know, given our casework, is that when a child is facing a forced marriage, it is unfortunately often the parents who are coercing that child into marriage. Skipping forward to today, there's been a lot of progress made, which is fantastic. So in 2023, 7 states have completely ended child marriage, and I've listed those out here for everyone. And there are only 7 states left that don't have any minimum marriage age on the book. So that's great progress to see. But, again, with only 7 states ending child marriage, that means 43 in DC still allow it. And so a lot of progress left to be made as well. So when we're talking about child marriage, from Tahirih's perspective, I want to be clear that we don't necessarily believe that every single child marriage is a forced marriage. But with that said, what the research in the US shows, what data we've gathered shows, and what our experience working forced marriage cases shows is that the majority of child marriages in the United States do involve really concerning factors that could point to aspects of force, fraud, or coercion. For example, the vast majority of cases, and this is true nationwide, it's also true specifically in DC. I'll get to that data in a little bit. The vast majority of cases involve a girl child marrying an adult man. There's sort of a misperception when we talk about this issue that, oh, well, child marriages, it must just be high school sweethearts marrying each other, where, it's a 16 and 17-year-old. And unfortunately, that's not the case. In some of these cases, the adults can be decades older than the child that they're marrying. A lot of state laws, and this includes DC laws, allow marriages of children to go forward even when sex between those partners would be a crime due to either the age of the partners or the relationship between them. So something like an adult in a position of responsibility over the child. And many state laws, and again, including DC's law, permit child marriages to go forward based on the consent, not of that child, but of the parents specifically. And we find that to be particularly dangerous when the law allows for a single parent to consent to the marriage of a child, because this can be done over the objections of perhaps a more protective parent, or in some cases without that parent even being aware. And what we know, again, from our casework and from research across the US is that, forced or not, child marriage can lead to devastating consequences for the child in both the immediate and long term. So I'll give a quick rundown of what some US-specific research has shown as to the consequences of forced marriage in the United States. It shows that girls who marry underage have higher dropout rates from school. They face increased medical and mental health problems, greater vulnerability to violence, and greater likelihood of future poverty. The marriages themselves, if we're concerned about strong marriages, are also not successful in most cases. Up to 80% of child marriages eventually end in a divorce. Unfortunately, before that divorce occurs, a lot of harm has already been done. And marriage at an early age can also double down on the consequences of teen pregnancy. There's a specific study that examined the life outcomes for girls who got pregnant underage and then compared the outcomes for girls who married versus those who didn't marry. And it actually found that the girls who did not marry had better life outcomes. So we know whatever a girl's starting point, child marriage really stacks the odds higher against her, and it increases her risk of instability and insecurity over the course of her life. Now, I talked a little bit about the national picture, but I want to zoom in specifically on sort of the area of the country surrounding DC, because we've really seen a lot of leadership from the states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic on this issue. So Virginia was actually the first state to pass a law addressing this issue in the current wave of reforms. That was in 2016. Virginia passed a law that limited marriage to legal adults. And basically what that means is they allowed for marriage of, an adult age 18 or a court-emancipated minor. Since then, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York have all ended child marriage completely by setting that minimum age of marriage at the age of adulthood at 18 without any exceptions. Maryland just last year passed a law that limited child marriage, unfortunately didn't end it entirely, but importantly, that law does include a residency requirement, which means minors can no longer be brought into Maryland for marriage from other states. And West Virginia actually has a reform that's advancing. Just earlier this week, a reform to end child marriage in West Virginia passed their state house with an overwhelming majority. I think it was 84-13 was the vote. And so we're seeing movement there as well, which is fantastic. And the reason I'm talking about the region and not just DC itself is what we've seen in our casework and in working with survivor advocates on this issue is that there's a real risk of what we refer to as sort of policy shopping. We've seen that when one state passes a law to really tightly restrict or ideally end child marriage, children from that state get taken across state lines into other states to be married there. A specific example of this is when Virginia passed its law in 2016. Starting the very next year, Maryland saw an uptick in Virginia resident minors married in the state of Maryland. And so with the region really moving forward pretty quickly on this issue, DC not having passed a law yet is at real risk of becoming not only a place where DC children can be harmed, but a place where children from other states can be brought for harm through marriage as well. And the states that have passed these reforms prior to the reform, they were seeing hundreds of child marriages annually collectively between them. And so our hope is that when these reforms pass, most of those child marriages just don't happen, period. But we know that in at least some small subset of cases that there will be perpetrators looking for a place to undergo that child marriage. So that finally brings me to DC specifically. And I'll talk about the law in DC as it stands now and what that law has resulted in over the last 10 years. So DC, we're glad to say, does have a firm age floor. No one under age 16 can marry in Washington, DC, which is great. Unfortunately, we know that the majority of child marriages are those older minors, those 16 and 17-year-olds. And for those older minors in DC, there isn't really much in the way of protection. All that's required for a child over age 16 to marry in DC is the consent of a single parent. As I flagged earlier, that is particularly concerning when you don't even need consent of both parents, only one. And it's also concerning that consent doesn't even have to be delivered in person, it can be written. And so what our law sets up right now is essentially a situation where a child just needs a signed permission slip as if they were going on a field trip for what is in effect a contract binding them to often an adult man. Those petitions for a child to marry in DC are approved by a clerk only, and there's no oversight. There's no way for that clerk to stop a marriage if they believe that there might be coercion at hand or abuse at hand. There's no judge looking at these cases, looking for whether or not the child consents to the marriage. As long as that paper is signed, the clerk has to approve the marriage. And so that's had, of course, that's resulted in children being married in DC. My colleague Rimpal, who we have monitoring the Q&A section, she was able to pull data from DC specifically from 2012 to 2022 and found that 41 children did marry over the course of that time. And as we've seen nationwide, the vast majority of those cases were children marrying adults, not other minors. And there were cases, again, where some of those adult spouses were more than twice the age of the minor that they were marrying. I'll pass it now to Sara Tasneem, who's an amazing survivor advocate who's been working on this issue, I think longer than I have, honestly. And so she's, I'd say, the real expert in the room.
Hi, everybody. So grateful to be here and grateful to see all of you here as well. I started advocating on this issue back in 2017 when I found out during research that all 50 states at that time allowed some form of child marriage. And I'm happy to say that that is actually changing. Our movement to end child marriage has grown, and currently 6 states have completely outlawed child marriage. So that is a huge win, and that means that this movement is growing. And it also means that it's also becoming a little bit more visible across the United States. So I'm really grateful for that. So that's just a little bit about, my background in advocacy. I'll talk a little bit about my background in advocacy, and then I'll jump into my story. Again, I started in 2017 advocating to end child marriage because I thought that this issue just happened to me. I thought maybe I was a one-off case. And come to find out, it was happening to hundreds of thousands of children across the United States. And so that's when I really felt personal responsibility to take action on this. And I started working with Tahirih back then, and now I work alongside with multiple nonprofits, and I share my story and testify in front of legislative bodies so that they can understand really what are the abuses that child marriage hides. My marriage certificate protected many abusers in my life, and that is often the case with many survivors. And during the course of my work, I've started working with a lot of other survivors. And while each of our stories are very unique, and there's different situations, the abuses really remain the same. And those abuses include child sexual assault, rape, kidnapping, you name it. Children are exposed to numerous forms of abuse, and oftentimes they're coming from families that where abuses are already occurring. Sometimes child marriages can be used to hide other abuses that are happening at home, and that's exactly what happened in my case. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my story, and I just want to preface it with a trigger warning for anybody who's sensitive to that. When I was 15 years old, I was a freshman in high school. I was living with my mom at the time. I came from a family where my parents were separated. I was living with my mom in Colorado, although I had grown up mainly with my dad. And growing up with my dad was extremely difficult. He belonged to a cult, and he was extremely abusive to me and my siblings. So I grew up with not a lot of autonomy. At 12 years old, I was reunited with my mom, and I was living with her in Colorado. My dad had moved to California, and where he was really, a big part of the cult that he was a part of. He was doing a lot of work for the leader of that group. As a 15-year-old freshman, I had dreams of going to the Air Force. I had joined the JROTC, and I really wanted to go to law school. That was kind of my goal. And I had started seeing a young man my age. He was a basketball player. And I guess my mom felt the need to tell my dad about it. And unbeknownst to me, that's when he started planning my child marriage. So my dad asked me to come visit that summer in California. And unfortunately, I know a lot of survivors that this happens to, where they go and visit a parent and they never come back because they're, forced into marriage. And that was what happened in my case. I went to visit my dad in California, and basically as soon as I got off the plane, he told me that sex outside of marriage was completely against our religion. And the leader of his group was going to pick my husband, and that was the end of the conversation. Fast forward about a month into my visit with him, we were at a conference, and I was introduced to a man one morning, and I was told that that was who I was going to marry, and I was spiritually married to him that same night. That man was 28 years old, and I was 15. Basically, I was handed over to him, and for all intents and purposes, he became my guardian. Although in the state of California, he was committing statutory rape that very night and continuously throughout our marriage. He was able to leave the country with me, and he left the country with me, and we returned 6 months later after our spiritual wedding ceremony. I was pregnant, 6 months pregnant, and I was legally married at the age of 16 in Reno, Nevada. None of this really felt like a real marriage to me. In looking back at it, it was more like a kidnapping. I wasn't allowed to speak to my mom. I had been taken away from all of the people that I knew in my life, and it began to feel more and more like a prison after a legal marriage. And what that legal marriage allowed for my ex-abuser, it allowed him to escape any type of legal repercussions. So it stopped my mom from being able to call the police and notify them that there was a statutory rape going on. And it stopped me from being able to leave him. Because as a minor, if I had tried to go to a shelter, I would have been turned away. As a minor, if I would have tried to file for a divorce, I wouldn't have been able to hire an attorney, and I wouldn't even know how to begin to navigate that family law process. I was taken out of school at 15 years old. I had my education robbed from me. And that is actually how I started fighting for my own freedom. I started fighting for my own freedom by fighting to go back to school. And 7 years after legally marrying my abuser, I was able to separate from him. 3 years after that, I was able to finally get granted a divorce. And he was able to go back to his life without any repercussions, while I was left with all of the aftermath, which I'm still clearly dealing with. And this is why today, this is why I fight for minors, so that they don't ever have to go through what I did. Like I said, every survivor has an individual story, and everybody's story is completely different. However, the abuses remain the same. And the fact is that my life was robbed from me, and it is completely legal. And it's an abuse that minors need to be protected from. And I also just wanted to give a chance to anybody if they have questions about my story. Okay, I think we can, is there another slide, Alex or Paul?
Thank you, Sara, for sharing that. And yeah, if questions do come up about your story, we can highlight those in the Q&A portion as well, if folks think of them as we're talking a bit more. So I think as some of the things that Sara highlighted in her own story is what we see, when we're serving minors as well in our direct services for minors facing forced marriage. And it's what we've heard from not only Sara, but for the many other survivor advocates across the country who are leading this movement to end child marriage. And what we know is that any case of forced marriage can be complex, any case can be dangerous, but when the person facing the forced marriage is also a minor, that just adds another layer of complexity and danger for that person. And that's rooted in the fact that they are a child, both legally and practically. Children will tend to have less knowledge of what rights they have, and in reality, they have fewer rights. They don't have the legal rights that an adult would. And even trying to figure out what rights they do have can be a difficult process. When we talk in different states and try to figure out, okay, well, what can minors do here and what can't they do here? We're engaging like pro bono family law attorneys to try and figure that out. And that's something that, the children in these situations should not be expected to have to figure out, like, what rights do I have to resist this marriage or to leave this relationship? There's also often a lack of capacity or standing to initiate a court action on their own. In our experience, when law enforcement is contacted about these cases, they often defer to the parents. And as we've noted, in a situation where it's the parent forcing a child into marriage, deferring to a parent as presumably protective of that child is not not helpful, and it can be dangerous. And it can lead to repercussions for that child, for the brave children that do seek help, that do try to resist the marriage, that do reach out to us or to law enforcement. If then the response of systems is to just defer to the parent, then that child is now left in the home with a parent who they've tried to resist coercion from, and there can be very serious repercussions to that. Children also have a limited, both legal and practical ability to leave the home of their parents. In many cases, they can't legally remain outside the home, and even when they can or are able to, it's practically very difficult to do that. There are additional hurdles for shelters who want to shelter a minor, and that's not to, I don't want to say that minors can't access shelter in DC. We've worked cases in DC, and we know that they can, especially with the amazing advocacy community that exists in Washington, DC. But for a minor who's not already connected with an advocate, there's the reality of whether they can access shelter, and there's also the fact that in their own head they might not know the answer, and that question might be enough to prevent them from seeking services in the first place. And so we've talked a lot about the problems and the issues and the harms that are faced. And I guess the good news is that the solution is in fact quite simple, or at least the solution to the issue specifically of child marriage. And that's to set the minimum marriage age at the age of adulthood, which is age 18. And with that, I'll pass it back to Sara to talk a little bit about the amazing advocacy that you've done across the country, and about the other survivor advocates that you've worked with in this movement.
Yeah, so I've been working on this issue since 2017, and I've connected with so many people, great organizations such as Tahirih. There are a lot of organizations out there that are working on this issue, and I would urge you all to just go ahead and start doing your own research and finding out, if you all are from the DC area, I would find out, is it happening in your community? It's really important that we become aware of this issue, because it just flies under the radar. And the folks that I've been working with are survivor advocates like myself. And I also work to support survivors who are either in the process of leaving their forced marriages or have left and just need that extra emotional support. So I kind of work as a peer mentor and provide some extra emotional support for folks who have gone through similar situations. And the reason that this is so widespread is because it still remains legal in 43 states and in Washington, DC, unfortunately. And so I hope that you all will see this and understand that this abuse, it really needs to be addressed. And it usually happens to kids who are already suffering from other forms of abuse. What I've seen with working with a lot of other survivors is that there was already abuse occurring within the home. Sometimes it was sexual, sometimes it was physical, but in all of the cases, there is some type of abuse that these children are suffering from, which creates like lack of autonomy, and also just not understanding what abuse is, and it just normalizes things. So a child marriage can be used as a way to often hide other forms of abuse. And oftentimes, coming from families where there's abuse happening, the parents are the ones who are forcing the marriage, not preventing it. They're not looking out for the child's best interest. Oftentimes they're looking out for their own interests, or the interests of the abuser, in my case. And child marriage often intersects with trafficking, and it almost always leads to other forms of abuse. As you can see with my case, abuse started within the home, and then it continued throughout the marriage and escalated. So it takes a very long time for children to be able to, come forward with whether or not they're being abused. And this kind of just continues that pattern on for minors who are already suffering from multiple forms of abuse. So in my mind, if somebody is coming to the state for a child marriage, that would raise a lot of red flags for me. And just seeing and working with all of the survivors that I do. Yeah.
Thank you, Sara. And just to zoom back out one final moment, I want to talk a little bit about the success that the movement has had, again, led by Sara and her fellow survivor advocates. So since 2016, 31 states have passed a reform to limit or end child marriage. You'll notice that number is actually different than what went out in the invite. That's thanks to Wyoming passing a law just, I think, like a week ago. And so that number is continuously ticking up, and we're seeing it go up every single year as states have their legislative sessions, which is fantastic. 7 states have completely ended child marriage, which of course is the actual goal here. On the map, you'll see the states with little black stars. Those are the ones that have entirely ended child marriage. And 12 more states have introduced legislation in 2023. And so, like I said, we're seeing this number tick up every single year, and we're hoping to see some really exciting progress this year. I mentioned the bill that's advanced through the House in West Virginia already. We're also seeing bills move in places like Vermont and a few other states as well. And I, again, really want to highlight the regional leadership that we've seen in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. And that's particularly important because of the cross-border dynamics that we've seen. So I mentioned the data that we saw after Virginia passed its law. There was an uptick in Virginia resident minors being married across the border in Maryland. In Sara's own story, she talked about being taken across state lines for the purpose of marriage. And that's something that we do really see play out. And so as DC's neighbors and regional partners are passing their own laws, there's that real risk not only to children who are residents of the district, but also to residents of other states. And DC risks becoming a sort of regional center of gravity where children can be brought for exploitation through marriage. Okay. And I know we have a couple of questions that have come in over the course of the webinar. And so I'd invite others to add their questions to the chat as well. And Rimpal, if you could just highlight the questions as they've come in. I don't think I can see them on my screen, but if you wanted to unmute and ask them, I'm sure Sara and myself would be happy to answer.
Yeah, so the first question that we've gotten, it comes from Pragati Singh, and it's, how is this issue interacting with the new growing movement of children's agency and sexual rights? Does it pose a challenge?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And that's, part of why we have webinars like this and why we have conversations with, youth advocates, et cetera, in the states where we're hoping to pass legislation, is because that's an important conversation to have. And to us, these two issues are not in conflict. They're, in fact, I would say that they pair very well together. The movement for youth to be more autonomous, specifically as it regards sexual consent. When we're talking about laws restricting youth's ability to consent to sex, there we're really talking about criminal laws, things like statutory rape laws. And so I don't see, and Tahirih doesn't see, any contradiction between a law that would say allow a minor to consent to sex with a willing partner at an age younger than 16, and at the same time having a law that doesn't allow them to marry until age 18. When it comes down to it, marriage is a legal contract that is binding the minor to that person, and in reality that it's binding them in what is usually a sexual situation. And so we see those as distinct. And I would also say that the law as it exists in DC does not allow minors to consent to marriage. It allows minors' parents to consent to marriage on their behalf. And so we see that as a really important difference in this area. But yeah, thank you for that question.
The next question that we have is from Richard, and his question is, what is the position on incremental legislation?
Yeah, I think, Sara, I welcome you to chime in here as well, because I think that that might be answered differently by different panelists. I would say everyone here, the goal is to end child marriage, and that's what we want to do in DC. We want to pass a law that says children are no longer allowed to be married in Washington, DC. I think there is difference of opinion on the value of incremental legislation, and at Tahirih we sort of weigh the the challenges that come up with that on a case-by-case basis. If incremental legislation means legislation that in reality is protecting no one, that's not something that Tahirih is going to support. If it's legislation that we believe will prevent a large number of child marriages while we continue to push for a total end, then it's something Tahirih again considers on a case-by-case basis. It's not something that we are pushing for in DC. In DC, we want to see an end to child marriage, and we believe that advocates in DC seem to be in the same place.
Yeah, my view has always been bright line 18, and the reason for that is simply because under the age of 18, you do not share the same rights as an adult, and you do not have access to same rights as an adult. So that leaves you at a disadvantage as a minor, and that is the case across the United States. So I would want to see bright line 18 legislation simply because of that, and also because as a minor, once you're exposed to the forms of abuse that I have been talking about, sexual and other, you become extremely traumatized, and it's very hard to untraumatize a person. I think the most simple solution is to set that bright line at 18 and to not have a patchwork of laws across the United States that allow for abusers to shop around and find out which states and counties allow them easy access to hide their abuse. And really, if you look at the statistics of the population that this is happening to, it is minor girls marrying adult men. And so that should be red flags to everybody that this population really needs to be protected from these forms of abuse. And if you know that this is happening in Washington, D.C., which we've heard that it is, then we almost have a duty to protect these minors from that abuse to be allowed to continue to happen. In my mind, one minor being forced into marriage is just one too many. And that's my viewpoint because of my personal experience. So thank you for that question. It's a really important one.
Thank you both for your response to that question. And then moving forward, we have another question. And it asks, as there has been a move to allow for young people under the age of 18 to seek resources for themselves without parental/guardian consent, protection orders and abortion primarily come to mind. What argument would be used to advocate for less autonomy for individuals between 16 and 18 when it comes to marriage?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think it dovetails with one that we had earlier. I would say that, again, DC law doesn't allow minors to consent to their own marriage. It allows parents to consent on behalf of minors. And what we know from the data in DC specifically is that this does not appear, the marriages that are happening do appear to have really concerning factors where it's not it's not two high school lovebirds marrying each other. It's a minor being married to an adult. And at Tahirih, we don't view that as empowering that minor. We view that as putting them in a dangerous situation that's ripe for coercion and abuse of that minor. That said, we are also fully supportive of movements to do things like, grant minors increased ability to seek protection order, in part because that helps minors who are in that situation and minors that we work with in our direct services to prevent unwanted marriages. I would also say, ending child marriage is not a silver bullet for ending forced marriage. We, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the FMI worked with people across the US who are facing forced marriage, both as minors and as adults. And so, increasing the ability of, say, a 17-year-old to get a protective order is important to preventing that minor from being married, not only as a minor, but also potentially once they turn 18. And a child marriage law might not protect them anymore, but it's important to increase that ability to seek services and seek safety at all ages.
Thank you for that, Alex. And then another question that we received, and I'm not sure if this is in relation to DC or more generally, but Dr. Athena asks, what are some of the reasons legislation is not passing?
I can jump in just from seeing and hearing legislators' thoughts on the issue. And I think a lot of it has to do with the lack of education around what child marriage actually is, and how easily a minor can be forced, coerced, or abused into a marriage. Because we often in this country associate child marriage with it happening in other countries. And we don't, I think as a whole, completely understand why it's happening here in the United States. But the fact is that it is happening here in the United States. And oftentimes what I get is a lot of misconceptions around what child marriage looks like. And I think Alex illustrated some of those points where, folks think that perhaps this is a Romeo and Juliet situation where, it's two young people getting together. We all know how Romeo and Juliet ended up. So I think it kind of illustrates that, minors really do need this protection. We do not allow our minors to drink. We don't allow them to smoke. We limit their ability to drive. So, I think this just kind of goes hand in hand with, protecting minors from abuse. And oftentimes that kind of gets confused with other issues. And I wanted to kind of point out, because I think there was a question about abortion, Rimpal, in that prior question. And I did want to point out that when minors are forced into marriage, oftentimes their reproductive rights are taken away from them as well. In my case, I had no access to any reproductive rights or autonomy. So I wanted to point that out as well.
Yeah, thank you. And if the question was about DC specifically, I would just say that a law probably hasn't, it hasn't passed in DC yet. And to our knowledge, there's been no effort to pass a law. Legislators and advocates in DC have been working hard on a lot of different issues, and this one hasn't been on the table yet, but we're hoping to change that shortly.
Thank you, Sara and Alex. I will just say that there are no other pending questions, but I will allow a few minutes for more questions to roll in, just in case anyone wants to put in some questions in the Q&A. So just making space for that.
Yeah, thank you, Rimpal. And I'll just say I'm going to jump to the next slide as well, which has my contact information. If folks want to talk more about any of the questions they asked, or if something comes up after the webinar, a question occurs to you, I'm always happy to talk about it. And you can email me directly at alexg@tahirih.org. And I would just invite everyone here to join us in ending child marriage in Washington, DC. I think to close the webinar, I'll just give a quick update as far as where do efforts stand right now. Tahirih has been working really hard to talk with advocates, and a lot of you may have gotten one-on-one outreach from us, but it's, I know, difficult for folks with busy schedules to do those one-on-one connections, and so that's why we're hosting this webinar to introduce the issue to advocates in DC and answer a lot of these questions that do come up. And so again, I'd really emphasize that if you want to have a more in-depth conversation about whether your organization in DC could support legislation that would end child marriage, I welcome that conversation, and please do reach out to me. I also want to highlight some of the resources that we have online at our website. I had a brief slide on there that talked a bit about the research into the harms of child marriage across the United States. We have a great one-pager on our website at tahirih.org/childmarriage that brings all that research together in a single place with the citations if folks want to read the studies themselves. We also have updates on the national movement, analysis of every state's laws that allow for child marriage, including DC's, and what makes those laws particularly dangerous. And then there's also a compilation of survivor stories. So you heard Sara's story, her story is included in that compilation as well, along with 19 other women who survived child marriage in the United States. And seeing no other questions come in, I really just invite everyone on this call today to join a coalition to end child marriage in DC. We're really hoping to work closely with you all and pass some legislation that gets the job done here in DC.
And thanks so much again to Sara and to Indira for being with us today. We couldn't do this work without you, and it sounds like there's definitely a lot of interest in this issue, and we are hopeful that DC will be one of these states that can get to 18 and protect minors from this harm. And as ever, just very, very grateful, Sara, to you for sharing your story. And we hope folks will be in touch.